Oh, hello, hello. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Captain Quasar, and welcome back to another live stream. I said it a few streams ago, and I meant it. But through this month, I'm gonna try and increase my amount of streams and uh, really tap into some true history. Um, I will say that when we get to the video, I have a video I want to watch that goes along with this kind of this article that I'm going to read first. This from yeah, it's from World History Encyclopedia. But when we get to the video, I'm sorry if I end up just doing a lot of whoa, that's crazy. But I'm learning right along with everybody else. I tried to do a little bit of some note taking beforehand, at least on this article. That way, I can kind of we don't have to read it word for word, and I can kind of just fill in the information. I also did like some cross referencing on certain aspects to make sure that everything's kind of above board as best I can. Um, but yeah, I think that's about all I have for an intro. I think. But thank you to everybody that stops in. I really do appreciate it. Uh, yeah, let's get right into it. We are going to be starting with pre-colonial North America. See, I think that I said this before as well, that there are too many tribes to go through everybody, like to go through every individual instance of like every tribe, every battle, every uh, like every civilization, but then also every like smaller group. Um, and the reason it would be like even more hard is because most of it's like lost history, even like when looking through a lot of this. But I do think that kind of getting an overview of the main stuff is kind of what's most important. So, yeah, let me just pull up my notes real quick. Oh, did I close my notes page? How did I do that? Ooh, ooh, ooh. There we go. So, yes, pre colonial North America, also known as pre Columbian, prehistoric, or pre contact, is the period between the migration of the Paleo Indians to the region between 40,000 to 14,000 years ago. We're going to be looking like around this range. There are quite a few older things, but I'm someone living in the United States, so we're going to kind of talk about some things focused in there for now. But we're going to work our way out as well as the month goes on. But this term, I kind of looked into this a little bit. Paleo Indians. This was only made in 2021. This isn't like necessarily an outdated term and is still used, but like most, I won't say most because I don't know specifics, but uh, from what I've seen, a lot of other scholarly sources just say like ancient indigenous peoples, but that's just what this article defines it as, and the definition is used in like literature and stuff on the topic, and is just meant to represent. It's used to describe a period of migration across the Bering Strait land bridge of the Paleo Indians to the modern day Americas between estimated 40,000 to 14,000. Um, or not, yeah, between an estimated 40,000 to 14,000 years ago. My apologies. Uh, but yes, this article actually does go into some of the colonization aspects, and we're obviously going to get to that farther farther down the line. But I do want to focus just kind of on these for now for this stream. The Paleo Indian Clovis culture, which it says 40,000 to 14,000, but I'm pretty sure the paleo, not paleo, I'm pretty sure the Clovis culture, which is just derives from the Clovis points found in Clovis, New Mexico in 1929, with Clovis culture being dated to around 11. I guess that's about right. It's like 13,000 years ago. 11,100 to 10,800 BC. Um, you're playing hardcore Minecraft right now? Get to it. You're feeling what it was like to be those ancient indigenous peoples running around fighting the like the actual monsters that they were having to fight. Like not even joking. Imagine fighting a massive beaver with nothing but like a knife and a spear. Yep, it's time to learn. Chicken jockey, yes. Um, but I don't know why. I guess it's just because it's lumping in Clovis culture with the entirety of Paleo Indian um, peoples. Because, like I was saying, is that 40,000 just comes from the estimation of when people came across the land bridge during the last ice age or whatever, and then spread along the coast and through the through the country, but assumed also it said in here along the coast down to California and some other spots, mostly just following the game that they were hunting to whatever locations they ended up settling in, and that comes into a later point when they kind of had started minimizing the amount of giant animals that there were. Really reducing those numbers, and had to kind of figure out how to uh, start settling down and gathering more than hunting. Because it does seem like in these early periods, they were much more hunters than gatherers. But then that shift kind of happened, and that's what developed then into um, uh, the why can't I think of the word? Just the farming practices that they ended up using. Yeah, imagine fighting Sid the Sloth from Ice Age. Chase Iron Eyes. Chase Iron Eyes. Honestly, that I feel like when you say it like that, that's low key putting respect on the name. Um, but these are examples of the Clovis points. They're these fluted points. There's two. There's different. I mean, there's a lot of. I was about to say there's two different types, but there's a lot of different types of ancient spearheads and arrowheads. But these were specifically fluted, which means they had these little carve outs where they could, put a stick or some other object on it to use as a handle. But then eventually they started using the notched arrows, which we will see. Um, but yes, as I said, they followed the migration patterns of the big game until they came to primarily inhabit a particular region. At this point, they seem to have begun to engage in trade with others. Fisher notes, who's Fisher? Let me get the full name. Ron Fisher. So Ron Fisher notes, because points were often found far from their places of manufacture, archaeologists know that the people of different societies exchanged them through trade or as gifts. Different sites also tell archaeologists about the sorts of groups who use them. A small site on a hill rich in spear points might have been a men's hunting camp, a riverside site with tools for making food, a woman's campsite. That's interesting too, yeah. Um, I didn't even think about that aspect of it, I guess, as I was looking through this, the whole idea of just because obviously different areas have different types of like sedimentary rock, so then they're able to then locate like where did these like arrowheads or spearheads come from, these tips, these points. Um, but now we're moving into Dalton Folsom culture, which are actually two different cultures. Dalton culture is in the Midwest, and Folsom culture is in the Southwest. But then they uh, are with the Dalton culture centered in the Mississippi River Valley and the Tennessee River Valley, and Folsom culture occupied much of central North America with major sites in Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and Wyoming. Um, but it like Clovis, in the way that Clovis was located in like New Mexico, these and then represented like the entirety of the Paleo Indian um, tribes, because it was just it was referencing the type of spearhead they were using, the because I imagine that's just the main source of archaeological finds that they're able to actually date. My stomach is growling up a storm right now. Talking about these arrowheads is making me hungry. Time for me to hunt some big game. But in the same way as Clovis, these projectiles also ranged throughout North America from around 85, or it says circa 8500, yeah, so BCE, 8500 to 7900. Oh my god. My stomach is actually, I'm worried. Eat some woolly mammoth, gang. Eat some willy mammoth. Some willy macmoth. But here's a little good representation of what I was talking about. So they have the fluted spears on bottom, seeing the early Paleo Indian like Clovis spears, showing the fluted tips, fluted points, and then the as we move up into the late Paleo Indian and into the Archaic era, they started having more notched. They started using more notched spearheads and arrowheads. But that is that. And then the Archaic period. I'm sorry, I know this part is a little bit boring. We're going to get into a more interesting video, which we'll be talking about a specific culture, or it's not even one specific culture. It was a specific civilization, which is interesting. But this is kind of just a little bit of information beforehand, so you can really understand how we got here. And I do think that I might go back on some of these, because obviously, like, when talking about Clovis culture, there are other cultures that are older than Clovis culture. So that's why I find it kind of odd that this article specifically links Paleo Indian culture as a whole to Clovis culture. But I guess it is just, I assume it's just because of the arrowheads, but there are other like artifacts that archaeologists have found of other like North American tribes across North America, which you would kind of just assume, you know what I mean? Like, even if they are following the game, there would still be more that would settle like in the north as opposed to central northern, I suppose. But do that's that. That's that. And then we move into the Archaic period. And the Archaic period was defined by the mound building that they did. The mound building that started as a means of ritualistic practice, because they wanted to get closer to the heavens of sort. They believed in like the sky. Um, the early it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because the early indigenous people in America believed in forms of animism, which is like the belief of like oneness, not just interconnectedness in people, but also with nature, and that all aspects of nature hold like some type of soul entity. Um, and in that, that's why they respect, like using the animal carcasses, things like that, is because it comes from this like idea of animism. Um, and I think that's interesting when considering the like the willingness for treaty and peace and like agreements and stuff that were then broken and spit on basically. But I think it's interesting that it does come from that like sense of oneness, and I think a lot of that is the reason why I think some tribal culture came out of that when they saw that it wasn't working. But then you see a lot of the later like authors and stuff of that era speaking about the um, like the path of existence and the path of resistance and stuff like that. It is very interesting, but like I was saying, these ritualistic practices were for them to, in a way, get closer to the sky, because they believed in like the earth and the sky and nature, um, and to do certain. So it was to be closer to this, like to the sky, to the heavens, if you want to say that, while still being uh, connected to the ground, to the earth. But those mounds eventually turned into, well, it says they started. I don't know if it's like they only started as ritual sites, but it said ritual sites and political sites, and eventually, um, uh, residential areas and burials and stuff. We live. Let's go. So true. Yeah, the stars too. That too. Yeah, and these mountains were initially created as sacred spaces where rituals were enacted and may also have served as homes to the gods and to elevate the priests above the world and the rest of the community. Um, and then they show this is primarily modern day Louisiana, the middle archaic period. The earliest mounds date to the so called middle archaic period in modern day Louisiana. And this is Poverty Point, which I want to look into that a bit more too, but we're going to talk about something else in a second. But Poverty Point was another mound society, and it was interesting that they stated that the like intricacies of these mounds and these structures that they built in the earth were only visible from the sky, like using planes and helicopters and stuff like that. So it's interesting the ability that they like the like level of intricacy that they must have like taken, or they must have like held themselves to develop these sites, because they eventually started developing them in different animal shapes and stuff, representing different ideas and concepts. And then moving into the woodland period, the mound building continued and developed during the woodland period, but it's also associated with ceramics being more refined. They became more refined, and uh, as did general craft work, as evidenced by statuary, tools, and weapons. In the Southwest, nations like the Hohokam built cities and designed efficient irrigation systems. In Alaska, the Inuit developed stone lamps, large fish hooks, better knives, and harpoons. Toward the east, individual nations built mounds not only for as sacred places, but for burial and residential purposes, and each different group engaged in long distance and local trade. I'm just making sure that I'm not missing anything else from this, because we're about to get to the point that I wanted to really talk about in this stream. The Mississippian culture. The Mississippian culture is so called because the people primarily lived in the Mississippi River Valley, but they also established cities and villages in the Ohio River Valley, Tennessee River Valley, and elsewhere, ranging from the Northeast down to Louisiana and out towards Indiana. The Mississippian culture best the Mississippian culture is best known, or their best known communities were the Adena culture and the Hopewell culture, who built numerous mounds and further developed trade, commerce, craftworks, and technology. The Adena built cone shaped mounds, while the Hopewell were more intricate, often in the shapes of animals, but both served a religious function. So, we saw in the woodland period, they had the burial in so that was towards the east, had the burial and residential purposes, and then the Mississippian culture. That's kind of interesting too. It's not far off. It's just more mid, I suppose, more Midwest, but not even really going down to Louisiana. But I guess it's just getting more central. Um, or at least moving that way. Do do do. As with Poverty Point, the mounds at the mounds of the Hopo culture can only be fully recognized and appreciated from above. How the people were able to create a work they themselves could not see is unknown. The skill of the Adena and Hopewell in their ceramics, artwork, and technology, such as irrigation ditches, is impressive, as is their apparent talent in farming and abilities in trade. Scholar Yvonne Wickham Dennis comments on the perception of Native Americans as noble savages quietly wandering the land, writing, "Far from being the passive children of nature depicted in colonial reports, Indians practiced calculated and extensive resource management, nor were the people of the Midwest simple nomads, but urbanized engineers, long distance traders, and large scale farmers." And I mean, I won't say simple nomads, but it did depend on the tribes, and I don't mean to speak against an actual scholar. But I mean, there were nomadic cultures, right? Like that was, and obviously I'll look into that more too, because maybe I've been lied to about the history of the Comanche, and maybe we need to look into it. But I know the Comanche also, I know the Comanche were also feared by other tribes, though, for their ability to come in and kind of wreak some havoc. But yes, here's what I was trying to get to. I don't know why it was hard for me to find the red, literally the red words. Another nation considered distinct from both the Adena and Hopewell built this, or okay, another nation considered distinct from both the Adena and Hopewell built the city of Cahokia in modern day Illinois, the largest urban center in North America prior to the 18th century, which flourished between circa 650 to circa 1350 current era. Sorry, I'm used to before Christ and after death. What's with all this liberal shit? Cahokia may have developed through an appeal by the priestly class of neighboring communities to come and participate in the construction of the city's enormous ritualistic mounds, known as Monk's Mound today, as well as the other 119 mounds used for other purposes. Cahokia was a grand city with a wide central plaza, shops, ball fields, a solar calendar, residences for the lower class, and others for the elite, and long fields of corn and other crops. The Cahokians' cultivation of corn is one of the aspects separating them from other earlier cultures, which had not mastered this crop. Their corn cultivation was so successful it not only fed the people of the city, but was used in local and long distance trade. And so this is what I kind of want to look at is the grand city of Cahokia, which actually rose and fell before colonialization. It's presumed that it could have been because of like religious or political shifts. It is the corn. Um, but yes, this is what I wanted to look at. Sorry. There was something else I wanted to say. Completely forgot. It was aliens. The aliens took them out. Well, we're going to find out. So this comes from Ancient Americas, and it's called Cahokia, Mississippian Metropolis. I am interested.
In 1811, a frontier lawyer and future congressman, Henry Brackenridge, was in the city of St. Louis after traveling up the Mississippi River. Thanks to the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, this was the edge of the new frontier. Indeed, Lewis and Clark's expedition had only just returned to the city 4 years earlier, and Brackenridge made a point to document everything about his journey up the river. In doing so, Brackenridge noted a discovery that astonished him. He wrote in his journal,
I crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, and after passing through the wood which borders the river, about a half a mile in width, entered an extensive open plain. In 15 minutes, I found myself in the midst of a group of mounds, mostly of a circular shape, and at a distance resembling enormous haystacks scattered through a meadow. One of the largest which I ascended was about 200 paces in circumference at the bottom, the form nearly square, though it had evidently undergone considerable alteration from the washing of the rains. The top was level, with an area sufficient to contain several hundred men. Around me, I counted 20 mounds, or pyramids, besides a great number of small artificial elevations. Pursuing my walk along the bank of the Cahokia, I passed 8 others in the distance of 3 miles before I arrived at the principal assemblage. When I reached the foot of...
See, that's how I know the game Red Dead Redemption is realistic. Just riding through the forest, and you look over and you're like, whoa, I just found an interesting location. Just waiting for an NPC to walk out and offer me a quest. Strangers and freaks say what?
The largest mound, I was struck with a degree of astonishment, not unlike that which is experienced in contemplating the Egyptian pyramids, and could not help exclaiming, what a stupendous pile of earth! To heap up such a mass must have required years, and the labors of thousands. Were it not for the regularity and design which it manifests, the circumstance of its being on alluvial ground, and the other mounds scattered around it, we could scarcely believe it the work of human hands.
I mean, if you really think about it, that kind of speaks to the religious nature of it. Like he really stumbled upon it and felt this energy that it had, and that you can say that that's just because of the way that it was put together. But I think that also just speaks to how in tune the culture must have been with or I guess just in general the early cultures were with their religious practices. They kind of knew what worked, how to get that feeling.
What had stunned Brackenridge was the remains of the great ancient city of Cahokia. He would later write to Thomas Jefferson about the site and publish an article in the local St. Louis press. Incredibly, his published accounts of it appear to have been completely ignored by the locals, which is a shame because the site would suffer greatly for it. As Brackenridge could plainly...
Not gonna lie, my brain is kind of mushy today, but I do want to learn. I just might not retain it too well, lol. Hey, as long as you come to class, you know what I mean? Attendance is half the battle.
See, Cahokia was the greatest city built north of Mexico, and in its heyday, it was a city of over 120 mounds, arranged in large plazas housing a population of 10 to 20,000 people, with thousands of additional people living in the hinterland. The story behind the rise of Cahokia is not just the story of a great city, but the story of a cultural explosion that transformed eastern North America. Let's check it out.
Honestly, we might be watching this guy's whole, like, filmography this month. How many videos does he have? Only 54? Some of them are shorter than others, too. We might need to. I mean, I might watch all of them just on my own, too, get a little bit of information. But I guess we'll see based on this first video.
Cahokia lies along the Mississippi across from the modern-day city of St. Louis, and that's not a coincidence. For any of you not very familiar with the Gateway to the West, St. Louis sits right where the Missouri drains into the Mississippi River. Not only is this area blessed with an abundance of natural resources, but these rivers make it ideal for the transport of people and goods.
I gotta admit, ever since I did the maps yesterday, I did just realize how bad I am at locating stuff. I'm glad I didn't do like American states, because I know if I try and do American states, I'm gonna do so terrible. Like, I'm gonna do actually awful. But yeah, I mean, I was researching Cahokia before, and I guess I didn't put this together based on its location.
Making this even more appealing is that at the confluence of the two rivers is a wide floodplain called the American Bottom. In case you find that term strange, bottom used to be a common term for floodplains, and in this instance, it stuck around, so cut out that snickering. This is history. We are serious. These floodplains made the area very fertile and well-suited for agriculture. Now, Cahokia didn't just pop up out of
I'll do worse than you. Is that a challenge, Alex?
nowhere. For most of its history, Cahokia was a larger woodland settlement that had been inhabited since 700 CE. Woodland culture had developed out of the Archaic around 800 BCE in eastern North America and was characterized by small settlements practicing agriculture, hunting, fishing, and foraging. Late woodland communities were fairly insular, and for the most part, there wasn't much interaction between settlements. By the time Cahokia was founded, or Old Cahokia as it's referred to in the late woodland period, the times were changing. After the introduction of the bow and arrow from the west around 700 CE, give or take, communities began to increasingly cluster in villages, which necessitated an increased reliance on agriculture. During this time, Old Cahokia was a larger woodland settlement, and after about 900 CE, it began to grow steadily as more and more people moved in. By the way, the name Cahokia is not the original indigenous name. The name actually comes from the tribe that was living there when the French first explored the area. The original indigenous name has unfortunately been lost to time. Because of the floodplains, Cahokia had plenty of productive and fertile land for crops, especially maize. Maize, or corn as English speakers colloquially call it, was far more productive.
Well, corn is a type of maize, isn't it? Isn't that how it works? Maize. The Central American cereal plant that yields large grains set in rows on a cob. Or corn, okay. Because I thought there was different type of maize, isn't there? I guess they are the same. Interesting.
Than anything else woodland peoples had previously cultivated. That's not to say that maize.
Oh, it's mace in German? Interesting. It is weird how, because like obviously languages just develop from each other. They probably just have a shared father language, you know. What brand of cereal? Ah, it's a good question. Cornflakes. But what about a corn maize? Maybe that's where they got the idea. Hadn't thought about that.
Maize hadn't been around in the late woodland period. It was there, but it was farmed sparingly, and it wasn't a staple crop. It's not until the late woodland, early Mississippian period that this changes. This may be because, in part, at 950 CE, the medieval warm period began and turned the American bottom into a warmer.
Yeah, daddy language. I could have just said a parent language. I don't honestly. There's probably an actual term for that, but I don't care enough to. I mean, I'm gonna look it up on the side, but I don't care enough to look it up before I speak. Who thinks before they speak? Who looks up things before they speak?
And wetter area that allowed maize crops to thrive. So just to recap, at 1000 CE, Cahokia was a prosperous settlement steadily growing in size and farming maize more and more intensively in a very fertile area. Longtime viewers of this channel should know that when maize begins to take off, things have a tendency to change profoundly, and I'll just say now that you won't be disappointed here. Around 1050, for reasons that are not entirely understood, everything at Cahokia changed abruptly. This is one of those moments where we can only frustratingly speculate at what caused such an incredible change. Perhaps some charismatic leader inspired other Cahokians with a vision.
A proto-language? I think proto-language. I looked it up on the side. Daddy language, proto-language. I'm always going to say daddy language now. But yes, reconstructed ancestral language from which a group of related languages descends. Proto-Indo-European, ancestors of Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, etc. Proto-Algonquin, ancestors of the Algonquin language. Interesting.
Maybe Cahokia reached a tipping point in food surplus and population and had to reorganize. Dr. Timothy Paucatat has theorized
that... No, wait, that... That doesn't seem right. One sec, I'm going to keep searching, because I think that would just be like... What you're talking about at that point is you'd say like... Or no, I don't know, that is weird. I'm gonna keep looking into this. Now I'm going on a complete separate tangent from old Cahokia. Substrate language. Okay, a substrate language is a language that existed in a region before a new dominant language was introduced. Okay, that is what I was trying to figure out. A substrate language, also known as a daddy language. Thank you. Back to Indigenous Americas, ancient Indigenous Americas, Cahokia? Cahokia, was it?
Inspired other Cahokians with a vision. Maybe Cahokia reached a tipping point in food surplus and population and had to reorganize. Dr. Timothy Paucatat has theorized that the appearance of the supernova SN 1054, which was recorded worldwide in the year 1054, may have been seen as a cosmic sign by the Cahokian leadership, and perhaps this was a catalyst in the justification of the new order. While this is very speculative and unprovable, it is, I think, an interesting coincidence. By the way, if you have a telescope, you can still see the remains of this terrific supernova when you zoom into the Crab Nebula. Nearly 1,000 years ago, that thing would have been visible in the daylight. Whatever the reason, seemingly out of nowhere, Cahokia exploded in size, and I do not exaggerate. Old Cahokia had a population of perhaps 2,000 people during the late woodland, but it would grow to...
Even that is kind of crazy.
...to a city of more than 10,000.
That's pretty sizable. That's a pretty sizable population.
In just decades.
That is, yeah, and that is actually a crazy growth. Because it goes from about 2,000 to over 10,000. An estimated 8,000 plus.
To accommodate this sudden swell in population.
I mean, like they were saying, like we were looking into, though, it does seem like they did a lot of, there was a lot of trade going on, so I imagine that would probably bring other people looking for maybe to collaborate, join forces. Be like, hey, let's move in. Have you guys heard of Cahokia down the road? That shit seems fire. I'm gonna go live there.
Population, the site underwent a complete redesign. Old Cahokia was razed, and in its place, a new planned city began to take shape that would be.
Damn, they really were fucking. No, that's actually what it was. People didn't move in. They just really were getting it on. Each person had like a 20 kids each. Each person had like each person had like 20 kids, and then their kids had to have 20 kids, and then their kids had to have 20 kids, and it just kept doubling over the course of a couple years. Just a few years.
Dominated by huge mounds, plazas, and causeways. These changes were so startlingly abrupt that it shouldn't come as a surprise to learn that archaeologists refer to this moment as the Big Bang of Cahokia. Now let's get out our magnifying glasses and dissect this Big Bang. First of all, who was migrating to Cahokia and why? If we look at the early pottery at the site, we can gain some insight into this. Early pottery at Cahokia is fairly diverse in style, which means that people from outside the area were moving in and taking their cultural traditions with them. Among them,
God damn it, they're gentrifying Cahokia. Imagine that. The locals were like, God damn it.
people of the Coles Creek culture in modern Louisiana and Plum
Damn, that's where gentrification gets you, though. They fucking collapsed.
Bayou culture in modern Arkansas. Cahokia-style pottery even shows up at some of those sites as well, showing that there were older connections. A good example of this migration can be seen in the decline of the impressive Toltec Mound site in central Arkansas. Now, just to clear something up, especially for you Mesoamerican enthusiasts out there, there's no connection between the Toltec Mound site in Arkansas and the Toltec Empire in Mexico. That's a modern name, and one that shows us that enthusiastic archaeologists of ages past did not always come up with the most clear and precise names.
Yeah, the rent went up. They gentrified Cahokia. The rent went up and everybody had to move out. They knew it was over when the Whole Foods opened. Everybody they just picked up. They were like, okay, taking my garbs, taking my hunting gear, taking my fishing gear. Okay, I've got my like time to go. They fucked it up.
Oh well. The Toltec Mound site was abandoned around 1050, just as Cahokia was starting to take off, and it's likely that many of the inhabitants made...
My dumbass would walk past that and go, that's natural. This is clearly natural.
50, just as Cahokia was starting to take off, and it's likely that many of the inhabitants made their way up the river to find a new home in Cahokia. Like any great urban settlement, Cahokia was taking in new people from near and far. These people would have also brought their own rituals, traditions, and political organization. Cahokia was likely a multi-ethnic and multilingual melting pot of people. As Cahokia grew, it spilled across the river through modern-day East St. Louis and into St. Louis. But sadly, almost nothing remains of the great mounds of the St. Louis and East St. Louis sites. They've since been leveled and swallowed up by urban sprawl. Besides those, other satellite...
Damn. Those truly got gentrified. Those actually got fucking destroyed. And I think that's like probably the saddest part. Because like I'm saying, there was, so many types of... We set up our Christmas tree. We don't put like Christmas decorations on it yet. We just do it as like a holiday tree through November. But my cat just laid under it. He started moving it. I thought he was like playing with it for a second, but he's just taking a nap, laying there like a little present. But
communities have been leveled and swallowed up by urban sprawl.
What I was going to say is the fact that there were and are so many tribes. Like you could probably say, before colonialization, there was probably like, maybe like 1,000 plus. I mean, there's still like 1,000 tribes, I think. because there's 500 or 500. Is that right? Yeah, 574. I was gonna say I was like 570 or 370. 370 was way off. But there's 500 recognized tribes. Those are just the recognized tribes. There's obviously a bunch of other tribes too. But then in the past, there were all of these different like locations that, like, yes, even though they like I said, collapsed on their own in some way, it does feel like they should be regarded as some kind of you know, national park or something. You know, I mean, think about fucking when you go to Mexico and you go check out Chichen Itza, go look at their pyramids. Think about the amount of money you could have made off of that, America. All you fuckers care about is money, right? And you didn't even care about turning it into a tourist attraction. You wanted to level it for an actual Whole Foods. For a Best Western. Bullshit. They put a Motel 6 outside, or just, you know, just on the corner. It was the end.
Besides those, other satellite communities have been documented all over Cahokia's.
Yeah, couldn't even put a theme park there. I mean, you already have the land so easily. You could just put tracks up to do a, you know, little roller coaster. Weren't even thinking.
Hinterland. Some of these were brand new settlements, and others were previous woodland settlements that were absorbed into the Cahokian sphere. Now that we have a rough idea of who was coming into Cahokia, let's look at the why. As I mentioned earlier, Cahokia's floodplains offered a fantastic location for farming. It was also ideally located for trade and transport since it was very close to the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And yet, there are other floodplains along the Mississippi and other similar confluences, but there was only one Cahokia. Why was that? It turns out Cahokia was much more than just a tidy spot to settle on the river. It was forging a new, vibrant, and appealing culture, which likely played an important...
Those look like Anglo-Saxon burial mounds. Some were used as burial mounds. I don't know if they were in Cahokia, but they were at times used as burial mounds.
Important role in drawing in people from afar. The Big Bang was just as much a cultural shift as it was a demographic one. Cahokia wasn't just a big...
That sentence, I know he's talking about the Big Bang of Cahokia because it's on screen, but that sentence just sounds so funny on its own.
Just as much a cultural shift as it was in people from afar. The Big Bang was just as much a cultural shift as it was a demographic one.
The Big Bang. Like, huh? What are you talking about? And I remember where we are. Oh, okay. Cahokia, yes.
Cahokia wasn't just a big city. It was the center of a new order, a Mississippian order. These sudden changes touched almost every aspect of life, and they can be seen in everything from houses, pottery, art, consumption, and burials. Let's take a quick look at some of these changes. A good example of this is in the construction of houses. Previously, woodland houses had been constructed by digging individual post holes before inserting posts and constructing the rest of the house. Suddenly, Cahokians ditched this method and began digging wall trenches to build houses. This allowed workers to prefabricate walls on the ground before setting them into the trench, perfect for planning and quick construction. These are a trademark of Cahokian and later Mississippian culture. Also, a distinct style of pottery called Ramy-incised pottery emerges as the signature style at Cahokia. These were clay pots created with a shell temper and incised with sticks, reeds, stone, or bone implements. These incised designs show a rich cosmology through a variety of cosmograms. These pots served as both domestic as well as ritual functions and were so prized by people outside of Cahokia that foreigners imitated and adopted this style. Another important element of Cahokia was the game of chunky. What is chunky, you may be asking? Chunky was a game played by rolling a puck-like chunky stone across the ground. Two players with long javelin-like sticks would gauge the roll and path of the stone and throw their...
The Big Bang spin-off. Instead of Sheldon, they have Sheldons.
warp sticks as close to the stone's
I think that was pretty good.
final resting point as possible. Think of it like horseshoes, except you have to throw the horseshoe at a moving stake. This game held very important ritual significance to Cahokia and to later Mississippian people, but it was also a beloved spectator sport, and later historical accounts state that it was even rife with gambling. Something to note about Chunky and Cahokia is that a distinct style of chunky stone was developed at Cahokia, which is characterized by a polished concave stone disc. You can see examples of these here. These chunky stones are going to be an important calling card of Cahokia. In art, there are unique naturalistic flint clay statues of culture heroes, gods, and goddesses that provide tantalizing glimpses into Cahokian mythology. Along with these beautiful works of art, a new style and elaboration of art and iconography began to germinate at Cahokia that would be exported far abroad. This style is referred to as the SECC, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Now, that term is a bit of a misnomer because when it was coined back in the 1940s, the southeastern United States was seen as the epicenter of this complex, but we now know that the SECC had its origins around the Mississippi. Now, I do want to note that some of these symbols and motifs do have pre-Mississippian antecedents, but we shouldn't automatically assume that their meaning and application remained constant. Like many other cultural symbols across the world, they were likely developed, elaborated, and perhaps even reinvented by Cahokia, but we'll get into more detail on that later. What's important is that Cahokia was pioneering a vibrant new way of life. To people who had grown up in small, isolated woodland settlements, Cahokia must have seemed like an alluring and grand experiment full of wonder. With all that under our belts, let's take a look at the landscape of Cahokia. When Cahokia was planned out, it was laid out on an orthogonal design, offset about 5 degrees from true north. The reason for this offset is not understood, but it's clear that the city's layout adheres to this axis. With this master plan, the people of Cahokia built mounds the scale of which had never been seen before or since. Atop these mounds would have been elite houses, community buildings, and religious shrines and temples. Before we start diving into the features of the site, we need to make a few distinctions between the different types of mounds. There are 3 types of mounds at the site: platform mounds, conical mounds, and ridgetop mounds. Platform mounds were flat-topped mounds that would have been topped with a building of some type. These types of mounds are nothing new, and there are similar mounds at earlier sites, such as the Toltec Mound site we discussed earlier. Conical mounds also have some historical precedent as well from earlier cultures, particularly from Hopewell and Adena sites. These are believed to have been burial mounds for local elites, but may have had other functions too. The last type of mound at the site, ridgetop mounds, are a Cahokia original. With perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, they are not found anywhere else in the eastern United States. These mounds get their name from the pointed roof-shaped top that they have, although today these mound tops have been eroded and smoothed over by the march of time. Now that we have that out of the way, let's look at the site in more detail and start at the most prominent feature, Monk's Mound. If you're curious about where the name comes from, it's because Trappist monks settled at the site in the 18th century. Its construction actually began in the days of Old Cahokia around 950 CE, and over the centuries it grew bigger and bigger until the final construction phase at about 1150. The mound is the largest pyramid north of Mesoamerica, rising to a height of 30 meters with a base of 291 meters by 236 meters. And let me tell you, the view from the top will take your breath away. Literally. I can tell you from personal experience that it's a long climb and you'll be huffing and puffing when you reach the top. The mound is aligned to the city's north-south axis like other monuments at the site. It had a total of 4 terraces, which you can see here. These would have had their own buildings on top of them. There's compelling evidence to suggest that the second terrace was once part of the summit that collapsed and then was refinished in its current position. At the mound's summit would have stood a large structure, most likely an elite residence of the Cahokian leader. Excavations have uncovered post holes and wall remains which can give us a vague idea of the building's dimensions. Building the mound was a truly colossal undertaking. All the earth for this mound would have been moved by hand and transported in baskets and piled up slowly but surely. And don't get the idea that people were just piling up dirt. Cores taken from the mound show that specific soils and clays were used in different layers, and these likely had both structural as well as aesthetic purposes. For example, clay layers were probably added to aid in runoff. Recent estimates have put the volume of the entire structure at 740,000 cubic meters, or 26 million cubic feet. That's a lot of dirt. Probably too much, actually, because despite all that care and engineering, the mound has unfortunately suffered from sagging and erosion. Turns out that earth piled that high does not always like to stay in place. Even today, Monk's Mound requires maintenance to combat this, and
I mean, if you really think about it, even when it's there naturally, it doesn't like to stay in place. You know what I mean? How many times, like, just rocks fall off mountains from erosion? Like, oh. I always think about that every time I'm driving or something and I just see like a rock on top of like a hill and I'm like, someone should deal with that because like nobody thinks it's going to do anything until one day it does. Could be tomorrow. It could be in 1,000 years. Who knows? I don't, and that's what scares me.
to preserve its shape. If you're curious where all the dirt for this and the other mounds came from, it was dug locally, and you can actually see the remains of those pits today. These barrow pits formed depressions in the landscape, and many of them have become small ponds. To the west of Monk's Mound is another important but sometimes overlooked part of the Cahokian landscape, the woodhenge. Now, we've seen woodhenges on this channel before. One of the earliest examples we already covered at Poverty Point, and such monuments were also erected by the later Hopewell culture in the first centuries of the Common Era. Like its ancient and distant ancestors, the woodhenge was a series of wooden posts, likely around 6 meters tall, arranged in a circle. The monument was constructed to observe astronomical events, particularly the equinoxes and solstices. The woodhenge was first built around 1100 CE, and was actually rebuilt several times over the next century in slightly different sizes, ranging from 73 meters in diameter to 145 meters at its largest arrangement. The placement to the west of Monk's Mound is not a coincidence. From the center point of the woodhenge, the equinox sun would have risen from the center of Monk's Mound, which would have been powerfully symbolic. While we're on the west side, let's push a little further. Until the 1930s, the second tallest mound at the site stood there, the Powell Mound. The story of the Powell Mound is a tragic tale, and one that's shared by many a mound, not just at Cahokia, but in East St. Louis and St. Louis as well. The mound was originally a huge ridgetop mound about 94 meters long and over 13 meters high. The state of Illinois had actually made an effort to purchase the mound from the Powell family, but the family had not been wanting to sell unless the entire property was bought, a prospect that the state was unwilling or unable to do at the time. The Powell family had also offered to allow excavation of the mound for a rather large fee, but at the time, the lack of finance failed to bring about any such work. Little public interest also prevented additional funds from being raised. Fearing that eminent domain would be used, the family hired a company to level the mound via steam shovel to fill in a low depression nearby. Incidentally, that depression was likely the source of all the mound's dirt. In December,
I said, go fill it back in. I mean, I guess it makes sense on some level, but like, I don't know. I just do think like the systems in place that require it on some level is just what the issue is.
of 1930, archaeologists could only watch in horror as the mound was carted away. Archaeologists were able.
They literally said they did what Patrick thought of in that one episode of like taking the town and pushing it somewhere else. That one goes out to you, Alex.
To make some quick observations and note some burials, but not much else. With almost no public outcry, the second largest mound at the site was lost forever. But let's get back to the monuments that are still there. South of Monk's Mound would have been the Grand Plaza. Excavations have shown that this expanse was meticulously leveled out.
I would totally skate this rail on like Tony Hawk's Underground. Ooh, I would so skate this in Skate 3 or the new Skate period.
Smoothed and topped with a sandy soil to provide solid footing. In some places, as much as 3 feet of earth had to be added to achieve.
Where'd they add this handrail? This is for pussies. They didn't have a handrail like this back then. They didn't give a shit. They said fall down. If you fall down, you get back up, you climb, keep climbing.
This. The Grand Plaza was likely used for public rituals, feasts, games, dancing, and other public gatherings. The space was especially fine-tuned for public speaking, and reportedly the acoustics are good enough that you can hear a good speaker from the top of Monk's Mound on a quiet day. Commerce may have also occurred here, but that's still debated. One important and iconic activity that would have happened here was chunky games. The plaza provided a perfect surface for the sport. The plaza is interrupted by a few smaller mounds that likely contained buildings and burials. As impressive as the Grand Plaza is, it's not the only plaza at the site. There are also plazas to the north, east, and west that likely served similar functions as the Grand Plaza. These four plazas likely represented the cardinal directions, which were very important to Mississippian cosmology, and this design likely signified the four corners of the earth. This theme is also represented in ancient art as a cross in the middle of a circle. On the eastern side, there's actually a second plaza that was likely constructed after the palisade was built in the middle of the eastern plaza, but we'll talk more about that later. Of particular interest in this area is Mound 34, which was constructed near the end of the 11th century. This mound was excavated back in the 50s, and it turned up a variety of SECC artifacts from all over the Mississippian world, such as engraved whelk shells and effigy shark teeth from the Gulf Coast, arrowheads from Arkansas, and even the remains of a copper workshop. To the south of the Grand Plaza are two of the larger mounds at the site, the Twin Mounds. Mound 59 is a conical mound about 12 meters tall that is believed to have been a mortuary mound.
I wonder what effort has been put into identifying more specifically where those artifacts originated, because I'm sure they could use other artifacts from different areas as ways to cross reference to get a more specific, that's how they know in general where it's coming from. But I would like to know if they've done the research into that, because I'm wondering how far Cahokia's the legend of Cahokia spread to where people were really coming in. They were migrating. They thought, I hate being nomadic. Fuck that noise.
Mound 60 right next door is over 12 meters high and likely held an elite residence or possibly a charnel house on top. If you're curious what a charnel house is, it's a...
Is the word mound starting to sound kind of weird to anyone else? A little bit. I'm kind of just trying to not think about it too much. Mound. Mound. Mound? Mound? Mound. Mound.
A structure meant to inter the dead before a later burial. There are actually historical accounts from later Mississippian cultures that document instances of charnel houses on raised platforms near conical burial mounds, and it's possible that this is what we're seeing here. While researching this, I was really surprised to find that very little excavation has been done on these mounds, so there isn't much archaeology to discuss. But that's not the case with our next stop, because just beyond the Twin Mounds lies what is debatably the most important mound at the site in archaeological terms, the excitingly named Mound 72. Mound 72 is a ridgetop.
You'll always remember that name, Mound 72, okay.
Mound that has been reduced by centuries of erosion and plowing. At first, no one really bothered to give it much attention, and it's not hard to see why. It's not even 2 meters in height, and I even once read in a book that one of the first maps of the site left it completely off. But don't let first impressions fool you. There is so much written on this that I could have made an entire episode about Mound 72 alone. In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler first excavated the mound. He was actually interested in the mound because he noticed that it lined up perfectly with the equinoxes rather than Cahokia's grid, and that the center line from Monk's Mound went directly through it. He predicted that there would be a marker post lined up to that center line. Incredibly, he found what he was looking for. There was a post, which was actually part of an earlier woodhenge dating all the way back to Old Cahokia. The woodhenge was terminated with the rest of Old Cahokia, and the mound was eventually built over the northeast section of the former woodhenge so that it aligned with the summer solstice sunset and the winter solstice sunrise. As cool as that is, it's not even the most interesting part of Mound 72, not by a long shot. Unbeknownst to Fowler and his team, the mound had been constructed over a few smaller burial mounds that contained elite burials. These burials were made over several decades, and they were likely venerated long after by their descendants. The most prominent burial excavated contained a man buried on a blanket of over 20,000 shell beads from the Gulf Coast, all in the shape of a falcon or thunderbird. In this beaded burial, as it was later called, there were a few copper tablets, mica sheets, chunky stones, and hundreds of arrowheads. Several other burials were also interred with him, possibly his retainers or kin. To this day, this is one of the richest burials ever found in the United States. It's very impressive on its own. But things took a grisly turn when archaeologists unearthed some sacrificed bodies in the mounds. And not just a few of them, no. Mount 72 has over 270 bodies interred in it. Most of them were sacrificed. Some of them even appear to have been buried alive. Yikes. A large number of these sacrificial victims were young women in their late teens and early 20s. Now, some instances of human sacrifice in the eastern United States were documented by settlers, notably among the Pawnee and the Natchez peoples. But these instances never approached the...
That's why they went. That's why the people went missing. They ran out of everybody. They killed them all. The few people that were left were like, I gotta get out of here. They fucked until they burned everybody.
The dramatic scale seen at Mount 72. Sacrifice on this scale was completely unknown north of Mesoamerica, but it was happening at Cahokia, and it shows the power that the elites commanded over the local population. Another interesting thing
It's always those damn elites, am I right?
about many of the female victims is that we know from dental and bone analysis that they were not eating particularly well. They were subsisting primarily on maize, which probably means that they came from a poor background. We can also tell from strontium analysis that many of them were not local. It's unknown if these women were attendants, slaves, captives, or people.
See, again, it does almost make more like. Again, I don't know what the exact like religious beliefs are of these different peoples, but it does seem like it like at least makes more sense to me with like human sacrifice and stuff like that when you're a like group that truly believes in animism, that like the fact that we are all one and one with nature, because it's like if we eat animals, if we're still willing to eat animals and use them for that, and then we're going to ritualistically do stuff with the parts that we can't eat and use the use other elements for products, then why not sacrifice each other? Kind of depends on the circumstance, right? I'm not saying that it's good. I'm not saying why not as in that you should, but I'm saying why not as in it kind of makes sense in the thought process of we are all it's like, well, I'm losing part of myself too. Remember that. We are so lucky to have been born today. Yeah, I mean, in the past, it was basically if you weren't stronger and faster than everybody else, you could probably just die pretty easily. You had to fear death every waking moment of your existence. I heard this on a post, and it was a good point, honestly. Think about the people that were doing drugs when we were still like hunter-gatherers. Or not even like hunter-gatherers. Imagine like when we were still cave people and people were fucking doing drugs and shit, like eating like magic mushrooms. And it's like you were tripping out while running away from a giant sloth. While running away from massive beavers. And you're just tripping on mushrooms. Like I know they weren't trying to in every instance, but that's got to be hell. They were just trying to get something to eat.
People offered up as tribute from outer satellite communities. What is
But why the young women? I mean, young women were usually used in sacrifices due to like purity, right? Because usually young men partook in battle and stuff as well, so they'd use the women who were pure in every regard. Well, I imagine it's probably on both level, right? Like purity, and then also they need the men for battle.
typically agreed upon is that this ritualized violence was part of an
And again, I'm not saying that it's good, but I think that looking on it from that perspective definitely is it is interesting, especially because it brings the question of like it's like was it a cause, like was it one of the causes for the collapse, or was it merely a circumstance of what was the cause of the collapse? You know what I mean? Like, was it merely another effect?
Elaborate political and ritual theater meant to aggrandize elites and impress commoners. Even more interesting is that these burials date from the very beginning of New Cahokia, around 1050 CE. Even before the great mounds were raised, the politics at Cahokia were incredibly complex, its leaders immensely powerful. And Mount 72 isn't an isolated instance. It's just the best and most thoroughly studied instance. It actually follows a pattern among other ridgetop mounds at the site. Sadly, many of these have been destroyed and were only hastily excavated in salvage operations long ago, before modern techniques in carbon dating were available. However, these salvage excavations did confirm that these were mortuary mounds buried with honored dead as well as other sacrificial victims. And while we're on the topic of ridgetop mounds, let's look at the large
See, and I think that also speaks to it too a little bit.
mortuary were available. However, these salvage excavations did confirm that these were mortuary mounds buried with honored dead as well as other sacrificial victims.
So it was honored dead with, as well as sacrificial victims, and it seems like you would probably assume these mass graves were probably the sacrificial victims. But it is still interesting that they were buried in similar locations to each other. And again, I think that kind of probably speaks to that animism thought process of like respecting the dead, even if used for sacrificial. Because like I don't know, it is just interesting when you think about I don't know, just the past in general too. Because I mean, like scalping was happening, right? Scalping was a thing in it, like that indigenous people partook in. But again, it was sometimes done because it was like a warrior showing their ability, or that they had gone to war. Like there's a story of Black Elk, the cousin of Crazy Horse, who scalped his first like first colonizer when he was like 12 or something. It was something like that. And that's what I was saying too about like they were in battle when they were young. But yeah, it is interesting. But what I was going to say about the scalping is the scalping eventually became like I don't even know how to say it. Just the government was buying scalps. I guess not the government, the colonizers were like, hey, we'll buy scalps of Native Americans. Of all the indigenous people you can find, go scalp them. And then sometimes even indigenous people would take up those, those offers. No pain, no gain. Am I right?
And while we're on the topic of ridgetop mounds, let's look at the largest one that still survives. At the very south of Cahokia is Mound 66, affectionately called the Rattlesnake Mound for the pit viper nests that long infested it, and presumably warded off would-be exploits by Indiana Jones. By length, this ridgetop mound is the second largest mound at the site. It measures about 150 by 60 meters and has a height of about 9 to 10 meters. It was built along an east-west axis instead of the north-south axis. The mound was originally excavated back in the 1920s by Warren King Moorhead, and some 140 burials were found inside, but they were in a very poor state of preservation. Excavations also showed that this mound was built up fairly quickly, but I've never seen any solid dating of this mound in my research. Some have speculated from the mound's fill that this mound may have been one of the earliest structures at Cahokia from which the site was laid out. What makes this idea even more intriguing is that the Rattlesnake Mound is connected to Monk's Mound by a large causeway running along the main axis of the site, which was likely a ceremonial procession path. There are many other mounds and features we could talk about, but we've got a lot more to cover. If you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, I'd recommend picking up a copy of William Eisminger's book, Cahokia Mounds, America's First City. He'll gladly take you through the weeds and turn over every stone at the site for you. It's a good read, even for the interested layman. You don't have to be an archaeologist to enjoy it. Now that we have a good idea of what Cahokia looked like, let's discuss what life would have been like there. A city this big needs food, and agriculture was central to Cahokia's existence. We already know that maize was the primary staple crop and an important part of the diet, but it wasn't the only star of the show. The Eastern Woodlands had long had its own agricultural tradition, which is referred to in the literature as the Eastern Agricultural Complex. This made use of such plants as squash, sunflower, little barley, maygrass, marsh elder, and knotweed, and Cahokia continued cultivating these crops. The Eastern Agricultural Complex is definitely worth more in-depth treatment, but that's for another episode. Interestingly, beans were never cultivated at Cahokia, and they only appear in the archaeological record after Cahokia declines. Along with this small...
Did they have Topgolf? They said they had a ball court. I don't know what kind of ball they were playing, but they were doing something.
Small and large game, fish, and waterfowl were also hunted to provide meat. Farms and satellite communities spread out into the hinterland around Cahokia to help feed this huge population. The average Cahokian lived in a wattle and daub house with a semi-subterranean foundation and a thatched roof. As I mentioned earlier, these are easy to spot in the archaeological record because these houses all had wall trenches. You can easily see their outlines in the earth if you dig down. By the way, for those who aren't familiar with the term wattle and daub, it's a method of construction where a lattice of wood and sticks is covered with some type of soil or sand or clay mixture. It's a fairly common method of house construction seen all over the ancient world, not just at Cahokia. Certain houses or structures also featured a T-shaped design, but the function of these buildings isn't fully understood. Houses would have been constructed around a small plaza or courtyard. Another feature of neighborhoods would have been the circular sweat baths.
Yeah, they were playing Chucky and Chunky. Damn it. Chunky and basketball for sure. Asked them to put in a baseball court, a baseball diamond. I was gonna say basketball court, but then I said baseball and just went with it. You know, fuck it. Put it in a baseball court.
In which people would have ritually cleansed themselves. Outside of Cahokia proper, people would have lived in smaller satellite communities which were organized and constructed in the same manner as Cahokia's neighborhoods. Population estimates for Cahokia proper vary a bit, but most scholars agree that 15,000 is a reasonable estimate, with thousands more living in suburban communities. People at Cahokia were bonded by important cultural practices and ceremonies. First and most obvious among these was the construction of the site's mounds. You may wonder why people would have signed up for this backbreaking work, but there's actually a telling clue in the garbage pits that have been excavated at the site. Yes, garbage pits, archaeological gold mines. You see, Cahokians were repeatedly feasting within the city. Remains of deer, grouse, fish, fruit, stews, tobacco seeds, and broken dishes in huge numbers show that the people of Cahokia were partying hard. These feasts were probably associated closely with larger ceremonies, chunky games, and the redistribution of local surplus to allies. Those Ramian-sized pots we described earlier were likely given away at such ceremonies to visitors from near and far. The local crowds attracted to this would have constituted a huge labor force. Underpinning all of this ceremony and labor, however, was religion, and this was vital to ancient life at Cahokia. Reconstructing early Mississippian religion is challenging, but by combining archaeology with what historical accounts tell us of later indigenous people of eastern North America, we can draw some conclusions. I'm going to be highlighting the elements that we can really pin down at Cahokia. Mississippian beliefs and mythology really deserves its own episode. That said, one important figure in later Mississippian mythology is the Birdman, or Thunderbird. These figures are usually depicted as warriors with a beaked nose and striped eyes. Examples of birdmen can be found at Cahokia, most famously
Birdman? Like, Birdman? I don't think this is what they mean. I don't think they mean actually Birdman. Brian Birdman Williams.
On this tablet excavated from Monk's Mound. But recall the beaded burial in Mound 72. The beaded cape was fashioned in the shape of a falcon, and it might be the case that the elites at the city made efforts to associate themselves with the Thunderbird. Another figure that appears in Cahokian art is the Mississippian culture hero Redhorn, sometimes known by the longer but much more descriptive name, He Who Wears Human Head Earrings.
You know what? That actually is right. They weren't talking about Birdman, they were talking about Birdman. Great film. It does actually look kind of like him, I'm not gonna lie. Was this movie actually a play on the Cahokian legend? You know, I was watching a Birdman the other week, and I couldn't help but think to myself, is this a play on the ancient Cahokian legend?
Actually, human head earrings with long noses, an important feature of Redhorn's appearance, hence the name, have been found at and around Cahokia. Later historical accounts of Mississippian peoples also note an association with their chiefs and the sun, and this dovetails rather nicely with the Woodhenge alignments that we saw earlier. Remember, from the Woodhenge, the rise of the summer equinox would have been seen coming from Monk's Mound, likely from the chief's own house. It would have been some powerful symbolism. Another series of artifacts that can cue us into Cahokian beliefs are the female flint clay figurines that we mentioned earlier. These figurines depict female figures, perhaps mother goddesses or earth goddesses, and what is most interesting is that they're usually depicted with crops. In some instances, these crops literally sprout from their bodies. What role these goddesses played in Cahokian beliefs is not entirely certain, but they were likely linked with agricultural fertility, especially when we consider that most of these figurines were recovered from the city's periphery, its breadbasket, so to speak, rather than within the city itself. Speaking of agriculture, the intensification of maize farming may have had an impact on religion. Anyone who's ever grown maize knows that it's a demanding crop that needs the right amount of water at the right time, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that water and rain became an important element to Cahokian religion, and there's some interesting evidence for this. 24 kilometers east of Cahokia is the Emerald Site, a small mound site that once housed a religious complex near a natural spring. Excavations show that this site was built up as Cahokia rose in prominence and power. It's also marked by the lunar alignments of the mounds, so we can see an emphasis not just on water, but the moon too. The Emerald Site was an important location for Cahokian ritual because a processional causeway connecting it to Cahokia was recently discovered. This was likely used as a pilgrimage route for important lunar events. Even more interesting at the site is that many of the buildings show termination rituals and even a human sacrifice involving water. This is compelling evidence that water held power and sanctity, and we're going to see
What do you mean, they drowned him? Or they just poured water on him afterwards?
what happens later when that water began.
They tried to hang somebody in a pool of water, but then they realized he was floating, and they were like, damn it.
To diminish. Incomplete as this picture is, we can still get an idea of a very rich spiritual and cultural life that everyone at Cahokia would have participated in. Let's take a step back and look at the wider picture. Cahokia was a juggernaut, and its influence over the emerging Mississippian world was nothing short of incredible. Traces of Cahokia's influence can be seen as far south as Louisiana, as far north as Wisconsin, as far west as Oklahoma, and as far east as Georgia. One easy way to see this is through trade. I should note here that most archaeologists believe that commerce was not central to Cahokia's prosperity or influence or appeal, but it still played a role nonetheless. Exotic materials such as marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica and quartz crystal from the Appalachians, sandstone from Wisconsin, and copper from the Great Lakes were transported to Cahokia. Finished materials such as arrowheads, axes, blades, and exotic pottery have also been found at Cahokia, though they're not very common. Coming from Cahokia were Ramey incised pots, long-nosed god ear ornaments, Cahokia-style chunky stones, flint clay statuettes, and Cahokia-style points and tools. This exchange might look like everyday trade, but this is actually part of a far larger cultural intrusion by Cahokia into the lands beyond. Nowhere is this more pronounced than the northern Mississippi. Around 1100, northern sites from western Wisconsin all the way to southeastern South Dakota show unmistakable evidence of contact with Cahokia and a resulting cultural shift. The exact reasons for this are debated. It's possible that colonists from Cahokia migrated north and established new Cahokia-style settlements, or that people from northern territories visited Cahokia and brought back with them new ideas that transformed their homeland. Regardless, this transformation was rapid, just like the Big Bang had been at Cahokia. Mississippian culture bursts onto the scene and just subsumes previous cultures. The best example of this is the Aztlan site in southern Wisconsin. And no, there's no relation to the mythical Aztlan or the Aztecs, so don't ask me in the comments. Just another case of poor naming. Prior to 1050, the locals here had built effigy mounds like other people in southern Wisconsin and eastern Iowa. After 1050, Aztlan suddenly emerges as a Cahokia-style settlement with mounds.
Oh, that might be I think I might do that at some point too. The Marching Bear Mound group in high definition LiDAR. See, there's a lot of... Oh, these are actually really cool. The bears marching. They're going this way. But, here, well, that probably blocked it by chat, didn't it? Oh, it kind of did. Kind of see them. But, there's some cool LiDAR images of the Amazon and different places like that that have recently been discovered. There were giant civilizations.
After 1050, Aztlan suddenly emerges as a Cahokia-style settlement with mounds, plazas, wall trench houses, and Cahokia-style artifacts. Local styles still continued, but the fact that they're mixed up with Cahokia artifacts shows that this was a sudden intrusion very early in Cahokia's history and not a gradual change. It really brings into focus the influence Cahokia wielded. Aztlan is not an isolated example. To the south, Cahokian influence can clearly be seen from Spiro in Oklahoma to Shiloh in Tennessee, just to name a few specific locations. By 1300, Mississippian culture had diffused all over the southern United States and upper Midwest, and Cahokia played a huge role in legitimizing this new order. As glorious as Cahokia was, it couldn't last forever. Already at 1100, the gap between upper and lower classes began to widen, and factionalism was probably increasing. However, this is actually the period where we can date most of the site's mound construction. This construction spree likely displaced many people from their homes as new mounds and wood henges were constructed. When new houses were constructed, they paid less attention to the city's grid layout. During this time, there doesn't seem to be any signs of internal conflict. By 1150, however, there were signs that Cahokia was beginning to face serious challenges. The most glaring change is the huge palisade Cahokia built to enclose about 200 acres of the central precinct. This wooden daub-covered palisade was over 2,800 meters long and between 3 and 4.5 meters high. Bastions and L-shaped gates were stationed at regular intervals along the palisade. The construction of these fortifications represented an enormous expenditure of labor and resources. It's estimated that 15 to 20,000...
The drama is starting. The girls are fighting. Oh no. How will this end?
...logs would have been needed for the palisade. And if you think that's where it ends, you're in for a surprise, because that palisade was built and rebuilt 4 times during Cahokia's history. Although no evidence for an attack on Cahokia has ever been found, these walls were clearly a high priority, and it shows that Cahokia had enemies, most likely other Mississippians. Warfare was becoming a concern, and not just at Cahokia. This trend is mirrored all over the wider Mississippian world. At Aztlan, for example, an equally impressive palisade was erected around this same time. The palisade at Cahokia would have also had profound social consequences because it cut directly through neighborhoods and public spaces. Those living within the walls were clearly differentiated from those living outside, although they still would have been allowed inside for public events and ceremonies as well as when the city was under attack. Even more alarming than the erection of the fortifications was the fact that the population
I mean, that would honestly be like kind of a slight too, though. I feel if you if you're like, yeah, we can be protected, but our stuff is still going to get destroyed because we're outside of the palisade.
was beginning to shrink by 1200. In the decades after 1200, Cahokia was severely depopulated and only had a population of about 3,000 to 4,500,
Oh wow, they were back down to their early numbers. Remember when they started with like less than 2,000?
down from its peak population of perhaps 15,000 people. Whatever appeal Cahokia had had 2 centuries earlier had faded, and people were now leaving in droves. Without a large population to support it, Cahokia imploded like a star at the end of its life. By 1350, the city was completely abandoned, as well as most of the American bottom. What caused this precipitous decline? Unfortunately, Cahokia's decline and its final demise are just as mysterious as its rise. Many causes have been suggested, and we'll take a look at these real quick. First, and perhaps most common, is that Cahokia's incredible population depleted its local resources. In particular, forests would have been felled in huge numbers for construction material and firewood. Remember, the palisade alone would have required huge amounts of lumber. Archaeologists have speculated since the 90s that this mistake would have resulted in erosion and localized flooding episodes that would have catastrophically wiped out young crops. However, in recent years, this theory has been reevaluated and challenged by recent archaeological work at Cahokia, which has shown that no such flooding occurred. Others have pointed out that changes in climate and drought episodes had an impact not just on Cahokian harvests, but on people's faith in the leadership. According to these,
I guess that makes sense because like if you're in like a floodplain or whatever, like in like a river path, you do, and then you kind of also create your religion around water. The depletion of the water in times of drought would definitely become not just a like economic issue with your production, but it would end up being a cultural issue with people losing support through the religious beliefs. Was that enough commentary, Rum Tum Tugger? I'm trying. Like I said, it's hard. Hey, I put like an extra, I don't know, like 15 minutes onto this video, maybe 20 minutes, maybe. I'm trying. I'm learning just like you. I'm taking it all in, absorbing.
Opponents, the end of the medieval warm period in 1200 CE and a series of prior droughts had had a calamitous impact on the local agriculture, and that this in turn discredited the Cahokian leadership's ability to intercede with the gods. This could have possibly coincided with a wider political decline as well. Former satellite communities might have broken away from Cahokia's control, depriving Cahokia of their resources. Others have suggested that warfare and conflict contributed to Cahokia's fall. Obviously, warfare and conflict were a concern of later Cahokians because they went to huge lengths to fortify their city. As I mentioned earlier, no direct evidence of warfare exists at Cahokia, though warfare would become rampant among Mississippians in the post-Cahokian world. However, at the nearby East St. Louis site, salvage archaeology has revealed that much of the site was burned down around the same time that the fortifications in Cahokia.
And to be extra fair to me, I think I speak a lot faster than this guy. He's talking a little slow. So really, I could have gotten this video done in like, in less than 30 minutes. 22 and a half minutes, I could have gotten it done.
Yeah, we're going up. Whether this was the result of an attack or an accident is unknown. An interesting coincidence, but hardly a smoking gun.
But I'm not going to do that to you. Bro tip, pause sometimes and say that's crazy, so true.
Some have suggested that Cahokia's huge, dense population was at a higher risk of disease due to the effects of poor sanitation, a challenge faced by all ancient urban populations worldwide. And indeed, there is some evidence to suggest that as Cahokia grew, the health of the common people suffered. Whatever the case, Cahokia was a ghost town by 1350. You may be wondering what happened to the tens of thousands of people that had formerly populated Cahokia and its hinterland. Although it's impossible to trace the descendants of Cahokia with certainty, it's likely that the ancestors of later Siouan speakers, such as the Osage, the Kansa, the Ponca, the Quapaw, and the Omaha, likely migrated from the American bottom to the west and south. With them, they took those hallmarks of Cahokia's culture, like chunky, urban planning, and its ceremonial and political practices. This emigration was so complete that the American bottom was nearly emptied of all serious habitation until about 1500. Oddly, however, no surviving oral histories speak about Cahokia or anything like it, and I have personally found this very puzzling.
Yeah, that was because honestly, when I first learned about this, I was genuinely like taken aback a bit because I don't remember learning about this in school, and I feel like you should. I mean, at least in the United States, we should probably learn about like the largest um, existing pre-colonial civilization. Like, I feel like that's a relevant topic to teach your class, but it shows you that the American education system wants to hide the truth from you. They don't want you to know that they had civilizations like this because they want you to think that they're noble savages.
How could such an incredible time in history not be remembered in legend? I think, however, it's important to remember that just because we admire a moment in time doesn't always mean that people who lived through it did. Cahokia may have been something imperfect or even oppressive that people didn't care to remember. Or perhaps oral histories did survive for centuries only to fade later. We'll never know. And that's going to wrap us up for today, and I appreciate you sticking around to the end. This video was a blast to make from start to finish.
Thanks so much, Ancient Americas. That was honestly a very interesting video. I'm sorry if it felt like I wasn't reacting enough. I'm sorry, Rum Tum Tugger. We in Portugal also don't go in much detail about the slave trade. We talk about it in passing. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, most cultures, like I've heard that like specifically like in Japan, like the Japanese aren't necessarily taught about like a lot of the terrible stuff that Japan was doing during World War II, like what they did in Nanking and stuff like that. Hey, now you reacted just fine. I'm trying my best. Yeah, Rum's just keeping me in line. Rum Tum Tugger's just making sure I'm honest, trying to keep me honest. But I do think that's going to be it for today. I know it wasn't a very long stream. I'm going to try and make the streams a little bit longer. Tomorrow's stream is probably going to be a bit longer. These first couple ones are going to just kind of be getting into the rhythm, you know, kind of creating a knowledge base so that when we get to more like intricate topics, things like battles and stuff like that, it'll become a bit more. I don't know. I can start adding in a bit more nuanced perspectives, a bit more of a nuanced perspective. But yeah, I really do appreciate everybody that stopped in. Remember, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Go check out some of my other stuff if you're interested in that. I am going to be back tomorrow to talk about some religious topics, including ancient indigenous religions. Not even ancient indigenous religions. Some of them are current religions as well. But then kind of mixing that all into other religious topics and stuff. I'm going to try and continue doing more and more streams. I'm trying to work up to 5 a week. If I can do 5, maybe even 6, that'd be crazy. But we're shooting for 5. That is the goal. Or maybe I am trying to do 6. But also maybe some other streams. I was thinking at one point maybe doing a music stream where I let chat tell me some music to listen to. I show some music I like. But that's not going to be monetized because it can't be. But yeah. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. This has been Captain Quasar, and I am signing off.